Funding for Current Conversations is provided by University of Oklahoma President's Office, University of Oklahoma Outreach, and World Literature Today. Welcome to Current Conversations. I'm R.C. Davis-Undiano. Today's show was shot at the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity in Washington, D.C. in early June of 2015. We caught up with two extraordinary social activists who have both devoted their lives to the struggle for racial justice. The first, Dr. Bob Suzuki, is Emeritus President at Cal State Polytechnic University in Pomona, and the second is Dr. Tom Hill, Senior Vice President for Student Affairs at Iowa State University. We'll start with Professor Bob Suzuki, and I hope you enjoy this extraordinary and fascinating man. You have worked for social justice, particularly in relation to race, over a lifetime. I would say you've given your life to that cause. Would you say that on the national scene, you've seen significant improvement in social justice in relation to race, or what grade would you give the national conversation about race?
I would give it a grade of maybe B.
Pretty high.
Pretty high, yeah, because I've seen a lot of changes happen, especially in higher education, with the development of ethnic studies, with affirmative action and diversity efforts on the various campuses. I've seen less progress in the society at large. I think it goes up and down, forward and backward. For example, I think our political scene has become far more reactionary and conservative. So I think it depends on the area you're talking about.
Even in higher education, there are some discouraging things. You will hear occasionally about a campus that seemed to have some kind of equity, social justice on campus, and then some nasty racial incident comes up. I mean, that happens, seems way too often. I mean,
Yeah, no question about it. And I think there are campuses that are dealing with it through various efforts, diversifying their curriculum, hiring more diverse faculty, things like that.
You have given so much. This is such a constant effort over your lifetime. Was there a single event in your life, or possibly a series of events, where your calling to do this kind of work crystallized and you realized what you needed to sign on to?
Yeah, I think there was, and it really goes back to my childhood when World War II broke out and the attack on Pearl Harbor took place. Our family was interned in an internment camp in the desert of southern Idaho. I was just a child then, only 6 years old, but that experience stayed in my mind for a long, long time. And when I went to college at UC Berkeley as a freshman, I took a course in speech, and the instructor said, you all need to give a speech toward the end of the semester, and it could be about anything related to education. And for some reason, I decided I would do it on the education in the internment camps. And so I went to the Bancroft Library, which is the main library on the Berkeley campus, which I later learned had the largest collection of materials on the internment of any library in the world. And so when I went there and started looking at references, I was overwhelmed with all the literature that was available. So I read through a good share of that, and the more I read, the greater I understood the huge injustice that had been done to Japanese Americans who had been interned.
How long was your family in a camp?
They were in there for 3.5 years.
That is a long time.
It was, especially for the conditions that we had to live under, because they put us into these tar paper barracks that were maybe 100 feet long, and they were divided into single rooms where a family was assigned to a single room that was maybe 20 by 20 feet in size. And so we had to live in that condition for the 3.5 years, and that's where I started school, actually. And when I started school, I didn't speak a word of English because My parents spoke nothing but Japanese, and we were in an isolated area in Central Oregon where my dad worked on a railroad. And so I had to learn English as I was going through first and second grade. And I almost flunked both grades because of that. And by the time I got to the third grade, I was finally speaking English and understanding English, so I did a lot better. But that experience stuck in my mind when I went to UC Berkeley and took that speech class. And I did all that research in the Bancroft Library. And the more I read about it, the angrier I got, because I realized what an injustice had been done to us. And so when I gave that speech to that class, which was taught by a graduate assistant with about 25, 30 students in it, it was an angry speech. It was a hard-hitting speech. I talked about the injustice that was done to us at the time, and at the end of my speech, the instructor, who was quite familiar with the event, asked the class, "How many of you knew this happened?" And one student raised his hand, and it was another Japanese American who had also been interned during the war. And this was in 1955, which was only about 5 years after the camps were closed. So it tells you something about the ignorance of the general public about events like this.
Even to the present day.
Even to this present day. And so that got me far more aware socially about the effects of racism on people. And but I sort of didn't really pursue that actively until years later, when we were in Los Angeles, living in Los Angeles, and I heard about a campaign that was being developed by the Japanese American Citizens League to repeal a law known as Title II of the McCarran Act. And when I learned about the McCarran Act, it was really being used by the House Un-American Activities Committee, this infamous committee that existed in the House of Representatives
Under
at
Joe
the time.
McCarthy, right?
Joe McCarthy era. And they were resurrecting this law that was passed during the McCarthy era and saying that this should be used to round up black militants who were rioting in the streets and to put them in prison, so that, and without a trial, without, just the same thing that happened to Japanese Americans. And so that really got me upset, and so I volunteered to head a committee to repeal this law. And we started a national campaign that lasted for 2 years. And we actually, I spoke to Governor Reagan, who was the governor of California at that time, about supporting this effort. And he actually said he would. And he held to that when he was president as well, because we did finally repeal that law. The Congress passed it because we argued that our experience shows that a law like this should not be on the books, and so we had a lot of credibility.
When you first started doing the research in the Bancroft and were learning about the camps,
Right.
and then later when you dealt with the McCarran law, how did you, it must have been such a process of working through resentment and anger and a lot of other things. How did you keep this from going in a negative direction? I mean, I think a lot of people would not be able to sort of channel this into a productive direction the way you did. How did you do that?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure how I did it, but I guess I'm not a real angry person, although some people, my wife might take exception to that. But no, I thought that it was a political process that had to be pursued. I couldn't see just playing around and not just being angry and not doing anything about it.
You wanted results.
Yeah, I wanted results. I wanted to take real action that made a difference.
A lot of people who are going to hear this discussion today won't have your knowledge about race in America or your understanding of the history and a lot of things, but they'd like to do something meaningful, and they don't want to just do lip service. If you were going to recommend that they take an action or do one thing that could actually advance the good in some way, what would that be?
Well, I would say that they should look at ways to volunteer for organizations that do good for others. You know, whether it's ACLU or it's various other organizations. The Quaker organization, for example, have done a lot of good things to help the social good. So I think those are some of the things I would recommend. But the first thing that I think it's important for all people to really deal with is their own identity as a person and as a group. Because my experience in dealing with white students is that the only way you can really reach them and get them to be concerned about these social issues is by getting them to understand their own history, their own identity, and what their own group has gone through in this country.
And they usually don't, right?
They usually don't, no. And I think unless they develop ownership to these issues by understanding how it has affected their own group, they really don't understand the stakes they have in this issue.
Would it be fair to say that if somebody sees their own background as just kind of monolithic, maybe entitled, versus the convolutions and the horse thieves and everything that everybody always has in their background, to the degree they don't have that detailed knowledge, they're maybe less sensitive to people unlike themselves? It's something like that?
Yeah, well, I experienced that when I was teaching courses in multicultural education. About half the classes were various students of color, and the other half were working class white ethnics. A lot of Irish from South Boston, for example, Greeks, Italians. And I found that I had to learn a lot myself about their histories. For example, I learned about the history of British colonialism in Ireland. And so I began to read about that, and I would give lectures to the class about the fact that the average Irish peasant during the British colonialism was no better than the slave in the antebellum South. That got their attention, and they began to look into their own histories. And I think if you can grab them emotionally, you can really get them to start thinking about it intellectually.
Do you expect to see in your lifetime significant improvement in racial relations in the United States? Are you optimistic looking forward?
Depends on what you mean by my lifetime. If I live another 20 years, I expect to see some change. The most promising thing I think about that is the demographic changes that are taking place nationwide. Pretty soon we're going to be a majority-minority country, and I think that's already, you're beginning to see some effects of that, because and the younger generation coming up also makes me optimistic about what changes might happen. So yeah, I'm fairly optimistic about the next, let's say, 20 years or so, but beyond that, I think I see far more changes happening over the next 50 years, for example.
Do you think the current wave of violence against people of color and police oppression and there are some negative things going on. Right. Do you see that as maybe kind of a stage we're passing through, because people kind of intuit there are larger changes in a good direction coming down the road, and
yeah, absolutely,
kind of
absolutely.
A last gasp of
right.
conservatism?
No, I think that's exactly what's happening, because there's a threat that they're going to be outnumbered pretty soon, and so I think that's a passing stage. It might last for a few years, but I think sooner or later it's going to change.
Dr. Bob Suzuki, thank you very much for being with us today. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you.
In this brief interview with Dr. Tom Hill, Senior Vice President for Student Affairs at Iowa State University, you'll meet a man who has devoted his life to the cause of social justice. I think you'll particularly enjoy the story he tells about his mother's social activism during his childhood in New Orleans. Do you think that national attitudes about race have changed significantly during your lifetime?
Yes, I think they have. I think attitudes have changed, but I think we need to put it in its proper context. They have changed significantly, but we've got a long ways to go. So I hope a lot of people, because their attitudes have changed, that we don't rush to judgment and declare the victory. That's what I would be concerned about.
It's hard for people to talk about race, or they avoid it, don't you think?
I do. It's one of the most difficult conversations to have. And as you begin the conversation, you can tell people uneasy. The most typical thing they would like to do is change it, if they can.
Change the conversation.
Change the conversation and add something that they feel just a bit more comfortable talking about, whatever their passion is. And typically it's not going to be race, because that's got a history that's not glamorous.
Is it American culture? Is it because race has been invisible for people for so long that bringing it up is threatening? Is that what's your thought about that?
I don't know if it's been invisible. I think it's always been there. I think we've tried to avoid it.
I mean invisible in the sense that people don't want to acknowledge it.
Right.
They're used to not acknowledging it.
Exactly. It's more difficult to deal with, because if you look at how this country got started, well, it got started on the wrong premise, quite frankly.
Yeah.
The ideals were great, but the actual application left a lot to be desired, because they built it on the backs of those, who had no voice. And to say, I'm a part of a prominent family, for an example, today, because we were privileged and we built it on the back of folk that had no voice. I mean, that's not something you want to stand up and be proud of.
I was reading the race critic Eduardo Galeano when President Obama was elected, and somebody said, well, aren't you happy about this? And he said, yeah, I am, but I can't forget that slaves built the White House, literally built the White House. Yeah. That's
part of what I'm talking about. And it's not going to be until we're comfortable, until we acknowledge it. We can't change it. And I don't think anybody's suggesting that we go back and change it. All we're saying is, let's acknowledge it for what it is, which is a difficult thing to do, because if you've made it almost, to a lot of people, it's like something's wrong with me having made it because of the way I made it. Well, a person today can't be held responsible for what their ancestors did. I mean, they just can't be. But you also can't ignore it and pretend that we did it all on our own the hard way, which is not true.
In your own work as a critic of race in America and an activist, was there a single event or a series of events that crystallized the importance of doing this work that you do?
Well, I had what I would call the consummate activist. I grew up with a lady, Mattie Hill. She raised 5 boys in the inner city of New Orleans. When the lunch counters were integrated, it was her duty to make sure that never went the other way. She would go, just a little brief description of New Orleans. We lived in kind of the middle of the city. There's uptown and downtown. Uptown is where the Garden District is, where the well-to-do people live. Downtown basically is Canal Street, the merchant area. Well, she worked as a housekeeper uptown, but she got on the bus every day before she went to work, went downtown first to go have a cup of coffee at Woolworths. She did that every day, and she would drag her children with her. I went with her, and she made it a point to sit there and make white people wait on her.
Wow.
Because it was almost like if she didn't go, they were going to reverse it one day. I mean, she did that every day.
Yeah.
And I also remember her taking the bus signs on public service. There were the bus placards that you would put on the back of the seat that says colored behind the marker. Well, typically the marker was all the way in the back of the bus, where there were like 2 seats available for African Americans. And you had to pack everybody in behind the placard. Her duty, once again, she'd get on the bus. The first thing she would do, go back, get the placard, and move it up to the front of the bus. She did that every day.
What an amazing role model. What a tough standard, of activism to set.
Look, and she never said a word. We were sitting with her, and she would drag us. I mean, we had no choice.
Yeah.
So when you say activism, I had one of the best teachers, I think, in the world in voting. She had to vote every time there was it didn't matter. There was no such thing as I have nothing to vote for. She went to the polls every time. And so I grew up with that.
When somebody's a role model like that, it just speaks, what they do speaks volumes, more than what they say.
She said very little. She was our mother, and she knew where she went, we were going. And so she drug us, and so it's kind of in the DNA.
I am so glad I asked you that question. What a great story to hear.
And thinking about it just to this day, I mean, I'm full. I mean, just thinking about it, she's here with me today.
Yeah. What do you think the biggest obstacle is to better racial relations in the U.S. right now? What comes to mind as the biggest obstacle to that?
People listening and talking to each other. I mean, we scream at each other, we talk at each other, we don't have the conversation, and it's easy to say have a conversation. It's really tough to sit down and talk to somebody, especially when you don't see it the way they do. Mm-hmm. You have to commit yourself to listening. We so often, in our conversations, if we talk to somebody says a trigger word, we stop listening and start thinking about what clever thing we're going to come back with. Mm-hmm. I mean, we really stop listening. Yeah. But it's really difficult to sit and really listen to somebody and truly understand what they're saying and try to get an understanding of where they're coming from and how they get to where they are.
Are you thinking of the kind of thing where if people basically don't listen and then they're out of contact with each other and then whole communities don't have knowledge of other communities and it just kind of spirals into a kind of ugly situation based on lack of knowledge about each other? Is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
That is exactly what I'm talking about, and especially when you have what people may perceive as leaders of the community. If a leader of a community doesn't listen, what you've got other people who are looking to them for guidance. Mm-hmm. And if they're wrong, they're going to take a whole bunch of people with them. And that's a lot of what's happening.
Yeah. I almost hate to bring this in because this is politics and it's a whole other discussion, but gerrymandering around the United States where people don't have to talk to people unlike themselves very much, that really hasn't helped either, has it?
No. And the more we're isolated or segregated from each other, the worse this problem's going to be because we don't have to deal with it. Yeah. And it adds to it. And you would think we've made a lot of progress, but in 2015, we're still having Fergusons, we're still having Baltimores, we're still having Clevelands. I mean, these are things that we were afraid of as a youngster growing up, that we were afraid of. Walking the wrong place at the wrong time, not doing anything, just being black, for an example, was the only violation that you made.
It's just chilling to think that in Ferguson, for example, people have complained for decades that there was just too much violence against the black community, and then it comes out every last thing they said was right.
Yes.
The Department of Justice has almost pushed them into receivership. They distrust that police force so much now.
Not listening.
Yeah, goes back to not listening.
They've been talking, they've been saying it, their voice wasn't heard, didn't count.
A lot of people might see this conversation today at some point. What would you urge them to do? If there's one action you would urge people to take that you think would go in the direction of advancing the good and what we're talking about, what would that one action be?
I'm going to violate the charge about one action because I think there are a couple of things several things that come together. Number one, listen to each other. Be open enough to have a conversation, but particularly have a conversation with someone who isn't like you. And race is only one aspect of this thing. Socioeconomic, culturally, the whole nine. Someone who's different, just truly sit and listen. And from that conversation, come away with at least one or two things that you're going to do to make a change. I mean, if everybody did that, I think we'd be in much better shape.
I like your motto, listen to other people, really listen to what they're trying to say. That runs through all your comments.
Yes. I tell students, and I have this motto, I will talk to anybody, anytime, anywhere about anything. Doesn't mean I'm going to do something, but you're going to listen. I will talk to anybody, anywhere, anytime about anything. And I've heard some really interesting things. Matter of fact, I've gotten information from people from places that I never thought. This is, and I'll share with you something and an incident that made me think about this. Never forget it. It was Eugene, Oregon, running Olympic trials. Ran a race and was coming back to the start line. There was this lady sitting in the stands. She had really thick glasses and she had a cane, which signified to me that she was blind. And the first thing I thought, what's a blind woman doing at a track meet? Well, some kind of way I got to talking to her. She said something to me and began to talk to her. And she told me, she said, yes, I can see images, silhouettes, but I see you kept your head straight during the whole race. Well, that was contrary to what I was trying to do. What I was trying to do was lean, but what I was actually doing was ducking my head. This lady was blind. She actually critiqued my race. As a result, I realized I wasn't doing what I thought I was doing. That really hit me, and I thought, if a blind lady can tell me something, you better talk to people. And from that incident, I decided, do not just look at someone and assume that they can't help you because you think there's a limitation there.
I think we need to carve this into wood. Really listen to people. Yeah.
I think you have to.
Speaking of really listening to people, would you talk a little bit about what maybe NCORE has made, the difference it's made for you, how it's influenced you over the years? Because you've come in contact here with so many, at this point, thousands of people. You've been a part of NCORE, I think, from the start.
From the very beginning. The thing that comes to mind is how little I know about issues of race and ethnicity. That's the first thing that comes to mind. And I get a reminder every year I come to NCORE. There's so much stuff here, you can't get it all.
I hope that you enjoyed meeting these two dedicated social activists. Thank you for being with us today. Join us next time for more Current Conversation. Thank you for watching.